Are we going? Okay. So we're going to continue our study of Samuel. I thought more people would trickle in, but I guess they'll come in a little later. And we're continuing with the Judges. And as the story begins, right, it starts with a woman who's praying because she wants a son, and eventually she's given Samuel, who then she dedicates to the tabernacle, to Eli. And the child, Samuel, grows up in the presence of Eli. And he grows right in favor with the Lord, and so on. And then in chapter 3:3, we know that Samuel, who is staying in the tabernacle, is tending to the lamps. And eventually, right, God calls out to Samuel and tells him that he is chosen, right, to be a prophet for Yahweh and to lead the people. So we begin tonight in chapter 4. So beginning at the second half of verse 1, Israel went out to meet the Philistines in battle and camped at Ebenezer, while the Philistines camped at Aphek. So here we have a map. This is all of Israel, and the area that we're going to be concerned with tonight is the purple section. So here, this should be a map fairly familiar from, we were talking about Judges. The tabernacle that we start with is in the blue little bubble at the top. So we have Ephraim and Gad at the north. We have Dan and Benjamin right below Ephraim. We have Judah, Simeon at the bottom. And then the big reddish blob to the west is the Philistine territory that they're kind of spreading out, taking over more and more, as they've been doing throughout the entire period of the Judges. But the tabernacle is currently in Shiloh. However, and here you can see there's the little dot at the northwest. That's where Ebenezer is. That's where the battle is taking place. So Israel is prepared to fight the Philistines at Aphek, which is kind of the, we'll say, towards the north portion of where the Philistines are kind of, reaching out. They're spreading north, right? They're keep expanding their territory. So in verse 2, the Philistines lined up in battle formation against Israel, and as the battle intensified, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who struck down about 4,000 men on the battlefield. So not good, right? They lose the first round. Verse 3, when the troops returned to the camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord let us be defeated today by the Philistines? Let's bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, then it will go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." So this is not the last time, this is not the last time that we've heard reference to the ark. This is not the last time that the Israelites have come together to go to battle. So we skipped over it, but there was the civil war at the end of Judges. And in Judges 20, we are told, "Then the Israelites inquired of the Lord in those days. The ark of the covenant of God was there, and Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, was serving before it. The Israelites asked, 'Should we again fight against our brothers, the Benjaminites, or should we stop?'" So this is during the confrontation between the Benjaminites and the rest of Israel. We have reference of the Ark of the Covenant. For some reason, it's in Bethel. There's some debate about why it's in Bethel, because it should be in Shiloh. The easy answer is it was probably moved there during this period for war concerns. So this raises a couple of questions, right? First of all, they went to battle without the ark. We also don't have any reference to, so when it comes to the fight with the Benjaminites, as we can contrast the two, with the fight with the Benjaminites, they asked God, "Should we go to war with Benjamin?" And what does God say? When Israel says, "Do we go to war against our fellow Israelites, against our fellow our fellow tribesmen?" What would you think God would say? I'm seeing a head no. I'm saying another no. Everyone says no. God says yes. He goes, "Yes, you go to war." So they go to war. And what happens? They lose. So they call to God and say, "Are we supposed to be fighting?" What does God say? He says, "Yes." So they go again. They lose again. So they call to God again. It's like, "God, are you sure this is what you want us to do?" And God says, "Yes." So they go a third time, and then they finally defeat the Benjaminites. So why did it take them 2 times to win? I don't know. That's a whole other conversation. But here, we don't even have a reference to them asking God to begin with. They haven't even bothered to get the ark first. They just went to fight. Now, it's against the Philistines, and they probably felt like they needed to, but it is odd that we don't have any reference to them inquiring of the Lord, asking for his blessing, getting the ark beforehand. They're just fighting. Yeah, I feel like that's probably a good assumption, that they haven't asked God yet. And even now, they're like, well, this didn't work out, so maybe if we go get the ark, that will ensure the victory. But again, there's really no clear evidence that they're asking God, is this what we should be doing? And are you going to fight for us? Now, they did with the Benjaminites, which is a whole other issue, because what's going on there? But here, at least, there's no direct indication that they've asked God or that they've gone through the proper channels to ensure that God wants them to fight this battle. So they decide, well, what we need is the Ark of the Covenant. Now, of course, we know what the Ark is, right? It's a box, just a big, fancy gold box. We've seen all kinds of depictions of it. It's a box. The Ark is literally the box, because the top part, which you probably associate with the Ark, is actually, right, it's the mercy seat. That's a separate thing. So the top plate with the angels on top, that's the physical throne of Yahweh. That represents his presence on earth. And there are various representations of it. The Ark was lost, and then it was found by the Nazis during World War II. I didn't even get a laugh at that. Very funny. And you may think that it's currently residing in some warehouse, by the government, but actually Trump took it when he left the White House. It's currently in Mar-a-Lago. Now, to be fair, that sounds like the kind of thing Trump would do. Just take the Ark of the Covenant with him. I don't think this is the real Ark, but it is funny that he just prominently displays the Ark of the Covenant in Mar-a-Lago. I don't know, I just think it's hilarious. So, we have no idea where it is. We're not there yet, but for now, right, it's in Shiloh. Verse 4, so the people sent men to Shiloh to bring back the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim, right, because you have between where the cherubim are is supposed to be the throne, right, of God's presence. And you often hear that, right, who dwells between the cherubim. We're talking about that space between the angels where their wings meet. Who dwells between the cherubim? Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. So, oh boy, it's Phinehas and Hophni, and they're the ones tending to the Ark. We already know that they're bad news. But, so, as I mentioned before, the yellow space below is Bethel. So in the end of Judges with the war of the Benjaminites, the Ark was in Bethel. At some point, it seems, it was brought from Shiloh to Bethel, and at some point must have been taken back to Shiloh. It's not made clear when that happened, but it was, again, probably during the war. So, Phinehas and Hophni, right, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, they're the ones who are going to transport the ark from Shiloh to the battle. So here again, the battle was in the northwest, where Aphek is. They went all the way over to Shiloh, said, hey, we need to borrow the ark for our war. Phinehas and Hophni said, sure. So then they transported the ark back to Aphek. So verse 5, when the ark of the covenant of the Lord entered the camp, all of the Israelites raised such a loud shout that the ground shook. Oh, they're excited, right? Oh, he's going to fight for us. Everything's great. So then in verses 6 to 7, the Philistines heard the sound of the war cry and asked, what's this loud shout in the Hebrews' camp? When the Philistines discovered that the ark of the Lord had entered the camp, they panicked. The gods have entered their camp, they said. Woe to us, nothing like this has happened before. So at this point, things have gotten really, really serious. We know from other accounts of the ancient world that very often armies would march with their idols, and this was, right, a sign that their gods were going to fight for them. And this is a representation, right, a way of showing that the battle taking place on earth is a symbol of the battle taking place in the heavens, that the gods up in the cosmos or whatever, they're duking it out. And so whoever wins on earth must be a reflection of who's winning in heaven. So, if the Israelites are bringing their God to battle, that means they're taking this very seriously. And whether or not the Philistines have their God is not clear. There is the theory, I'm not entirely convinced of this, but there is the theory that the tabernacle, right, the tent along with the courtyard, is based off of the Egyptian military tents. That when the pharaohs would go to battle, they would have a tent set aside for the war planning, for the war party, and for convening of the generals. And the layout is very similar to the tabernacle layout, with the big tent in the center, with the inner chambers, with the outer courtyard. I mean, I'm not convinced that just because there are similarities that this is supposed to be based off of the Egyptian military tents, but that's what some people say. But it's obvious, right, that the tabernacle and the ark were used militarily, especially during the wilderness wanderings and during the time of Joshua. So that is true. So in verse 8, woe to us who will rescue us from the hand of these magnificent gods. I'm sure that's what the Philistines said. These are the gods that slaughtered the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Show some courage and be men, Philistines, otherwise you'll serve the Hebrews just as they served you. Now be men and fight. It's interesting, right, that the Philistines know some of the reputation of the Hebrews, and here they're going all the way back to the plagues of Egypt. Now, we do know, because this is talked about repeatedly, once the Jews are out of Egypt, there are constant references. Yahweh tells them, Moses tells them, Joshua tells them, that part of the reason why Yahweh brought them out of Egypt as publicly as he did was so that all the other nations would know. Right? They're going to know what I did to you. They're going to know what happened to the Egyptians, and they're going to know that you've got a God on your side that's going to do some really amazing things. And so, as an example, in Joshua 2, when the spies meet Rahab, before the men fell asleep, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and everyone who lives in the land is panicking because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings you completely destroyed across the Jordan. So rumors are spreading, right, that certain things happened in Egypt. Now, she doesn't mention the plagues, which the Philistines do, but she mentions the Red Sea. She mentions some of the more impressive victories that they had in the wilderness. The Philistines, oddly enough, they go all the way back to the plagues, which, things have happened since the plagues, right? There was the Red Sea, there was Sihon and Og, there was all the judges, right? All the miracles of the judges. So, again, it's a little odd that the Philistines are going so far back, but this is not the only time we see this kind of discussion. So in verse 10, so the Philistines fought and Israel was defeated, and each man fled to his tent. The slaughter was severe. 30,000 of the Israelite foot soldiers fell. So this is really interesting. This is very significant, right? The Israelites have the ark. They think their gods are fighting for them. Well, I say gods. Their God, is fighting for them. The Philistines, on the other hand, whether or not they have their God is not clear, but they think that their Israelite God is on their side. And apparently they're fighting in a state of, they're concerned. So you would think that everything is on, everything favors the Israelites. And yet the Philistines, in their, caution, managed to get a pretty decisive victory, 30,000 people. Before they lost about 4,000, so this is a lot more. And things get worse, right? It just gets, much worse. So the Ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Oh no, Hophni and Phinehas are dead. I doubt we're too upset about that. But the ark is captured, and that is very, very significant, right? Because the ark, it's not an idol, right? But it does represent God's presence. And the Israelites are treating it as though it represents God physically on earth. And to lose that means to lose God's presence, right? This is a very, very major blow. And so the ark is taken, Phinehas and Hophni are dead. This was already prophesied, right, back in the previous chapter when the prophet came to Eli and said, God has summoned me to tell you that your kids are going to die. They're going to die at the same time, and Your descendants are going to die young. They're going to die violently. Like, there's a tremendous judgment on you and on your line. So we already knew that Phineas and Hophni were not much longer for this world. So then in verse 12, that same day a Benjaminite man ran from the battle and came to Shiloh. His clothes were torn and there was dirt on his head. Usually armies very often have runners, messengers who are assigned to go and carry messages back to headquarters, back to their leader, their king, or whatever. Many famous stories of these. One very famous example is the marathon runner, Pheidippides, who supposedly ran 26 miles to tell the people of Athens that they won the Battle of Marathon, and then he collapsed, right, famously. So that we have a mention here of a runner, and of course, you need designated people, right, because word needs to get back to let people know either we won or, more importantly, actually, we lost, because if you lose the battle, then the army could be coming towards you, right? They could be continuing the march, and people need to know so that they can evacuate or plan or whatever. So yeah, you have designated runners, especially if you're going to lose. So this is one of these runners. So in verse 13, when he arrived, there was Eli sitting on his chair beside the road watching, because he was anxious about the ark of God. He was anxious about the ark. He's not anxious about the army. He's not anxious about his sons. He's anxious about the ark. It's like he's worried, like, I might not see that ark again. Which, yeah. When the man entered the city to give a report, the entire city cried out. Now, the city has a wall, and they're watching, and they see this guy running. He's probably going crazy, right? He's screaming or whatever. He's acting frantic. They probably know this is bad news. Right? He's probably not acting like someone who's come to tell them that they won. So, interestingly enough, the first time we see Eli, the first time he's really mentioned, is when he's sitting on the steps or whatever, and he sees Hannah. And of course, in that instance, Hannah's, she's crying out to God. She wants a child, and Eli's like, "What are you doing? Why are you here drunk?" And obviously, she's not drunk. But it's interesting that the first time we see Eli, he's sitting in judgment of this poor woman, and the last time we're going to see Eli, he's sitting in judgment. So that's both kind of a bookend, but also not a good ending for the story of Eli. So in verse 14, Eli heard the outcry and asked, "Why this commotion?" The man quickly came and reported to Eli. So he knows the people are upset. He knows this runner has come. He knows that the news probably isn't good, but So the runner is coming to Eli. Now, why is it coming to Eli? Well, Eli is the high priest, and we're going to find out that he's pretty much the leader of the city, right? So he needs to know, because he's the one essentially in charge. So in verse 15, we then get an interesting little verse. At that time, Eli was 98 years old. We already knew he was old. We didn't know how old, and now we get a definite answer. We don't get a clear timeline of events. So how much time has passed since Samuel was called by God? Is it 10 years? Is it more? If it's 10 years, then that means he's in his late 80s when Samuel is called. And of course, according to Jewish tradition, Samuel's about 12 when he has the vision. So let's say that when he meets Hannah, that's about 20 years, give or take, that still puts him late 70s when the book begins. We just don't, again, we don't have a clear timeline of this. But something that occurred to me, because once it kind of dawned on me just how old Eli is, if Eli is 98 here, his two sons, right? If he had his kids in his 30s, that puts them both pushing 70. Right? If he had one when he was 40, that puts them pushing 60. And again, I don't mean this as just a complete bash on him, but I was thinking about Biden and Hunter. Again, this is not me just bashing on him, but it's funny because Hunter is known for his antics, and his father is known for kind of defending him. Well, he's just a boy. He acts like he's this kind of rebellious teenage rascal. Hunter Biden is 50 years old. And I was just kind of thinking, I think it's easy for us, as we're reading about his sons, thinking, well, they're just, they're just rebellious teenagers. They don't really mean badly. And I almost kind of feel like, and maybe I'm just reading into it, but I almost feel like Eli, maybe that's kind of what he's doing. He's almost like, Joe Biden, kind of just, well, boys are boys, and they go through rebellious phases, but, they're not that bad. And it's like, if they're still doing it at 50 years old, it's not a phase. Like, at some point, you can't keep defending the antics of your full-grown, children. And again, like as I was going through and thinking, because it didn't quite dawn on me just how old Hophni and Phinehas are in this story. Like they are, because I think it's easy. I think the Samuel even kind of sets it up for us to contrast young Samuel to the children of Eli. So we might be thinking, well, maybe they're just in their teens. Samuel's young, but they're just teenagers, but no, they are much, much older, old enough to know better. So it just kind of all dawned on me at the same time. So then we get in verse 15. At that time, Eli was 98 years old, and his gaze was fixed because he could not see. This is interesting. So my grandmother was completely blind. She had no eyes. She was shot in the face with a shotgun by her brother. That's a fun story. So it's not like because there are people who are legally blind who still have their eyes, who kind of see lights or whatever. No, she had no eyes. So she was completely and totally blind. She spent most of her life like that. So I grew up with a completely blind relative. So I'm familiar with the behaviors of blind people. And something that you may notice, for example, people who are blind, they tend to look straight ahead because they don't see, right? They're not distracted by all the things flashing around in front of them. Also, when they turn, right? If you spend a time with them, they don't turn their face; they turn their ears. So they'll cock their head because they need to hear better. So they have very peculiar ways that they turn their head. So this makes sense. I would see my grandmother, right? She'd be sitting and she's just looking straight ahead. Like she's just fixed because that's just how she sat. I can completely see Eli just sitting there. But also, because you visualize that, right? Eli, who's 98 years old, he's sitting at the courtyard or the tabernacle or wherever, but I don't think that it's too much to read into this. He's sitting enthroned, right? He's the high priest. He's the one who leads the city. This is regal language, and he's sitting there upright, regally, royally, just fixed, looking ahead. And there's a reason why it's set up this way. So we also had reference, of course, to his failing eyesight back in chapter 3, and we talked about how this may be a way of contrasting the declining health of Eli versus the continued strength of Moses. I don't know if it's how overt that is, but it is a peculiar comparison, right? That the Bible even lets us know that Moses never lost his strength, his eyesight was good even in old age, because God needs him to lead, whereas Eli is weakening, he's declining, his eyesight is failing, and at this point, it's completely gone. He's just totally blind, which, again, if his diminishing strength and his diminishing sight is a metaphor for the declining spirituality of Israel, then Israel is just totally blind at this point. Which it seems like it's kind of setting that up, right? That Israel's spiritual state is connected to Eli's blindness. So in verse 16, the man, right, the runner, said to Eli, "I am the one who came from the battle. I fled from there today. What happened, my son?" Eli asked. Verse 17, the messenger answered, "Israel has fled from the Philistines, and also there was a great slaughter among the people." You would think the slaughter would be more important than the fleeing, but Israel fled, there's a slaughter. "Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are both dead, and the ark of God has been captured." Now you have your Bibles in front of you. But of these four things, right, Israel is fleeing, they've lost a lot of people, your sons are dead, the ark is captured. Of the four things, you can look at your Bibles, of the four things, which do you think would be most distressing to Eli? I would think your kid's dying. Yes. Very good, very good. Yes, we already have the foreshadowing that he's worried about the ark. Like he's sitting there worrying, like, oh no, what's happened to that ark? Like, it's like he knows his kids are going to lose it or something, just completely, like, his kids would come back from the battle and it's like, where's the ark? Oh, yeah, we forgot it or something. Like, he knows he can't trust his kids with this. Yes. Yes, there's only one ark. He has 2 kids. Yeah. So in verse 18, when he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off the chair by the city gate. And since he was old and heavy, his neck broke and he died. Eli had judged Israel 40 years. So we're going to talk about this in steps because there's a lot going on in this one verse. But the first thing is, yeah, it's the ark. That's what he's worried about. When he's told the ark has been captured, that's what sets him off. And literally that's what falls off his chair. We get a reference here to him being heavy. And this seems intentional, and this seems really interesting that it mentions this. So, in one of my favorite stories in the Bible, it's the story of Ehud, the crippled Jew ninja. He's the second judge. And the guy that he's fighting, the villain, one of the best villains in the Bible, really is Eglon, the king of Moab. And the Bible gives us this nice little, just as a side note, because we need to know this. It is like one of the best little side notes in the Old Testament. He was extremely fat. So Eglon, calling him a king is very generous. This guy is not a king. He is a mobster. He is a thug. He is the leader of a group of highwaymen that are hiding out in the ruins of Jericho. They're just raiders. They're marauders. So he's a mobster who's very fat, hiding out in the desert. He is basically Jabba the Hutt. What? He is. He's literally just Jabba the Hutt of the Old Testament. It really is great. It's just, I love Eglon. Because he's built up like this great villain, and he's not. He's not even that smart. He's just this mobster hiding out in the desert, and yet Israel treats him like this great threat, like he's this brilliant villain or whatever, this cunning mastermind. It's like, no, he's none of these things. He's just a thug hiding out in the desert. And one man sneaks into the city and shanks him, and that's it. I thought, that's it, it's done. Now, there are some great villains. There are some very cunning villains in the Bible. Eglon is not one of them. But so with Eglon, right, we are told he is fat, right, because that is important to the story. Here we're told Eli is heavy. Now, could this be a reference to his weight? I guess that he has gotten old, he's gotten fat. And again, that would be sort of an indictment on his health, that he hasn't taken care of himself, that some people just, as they get older, they get fatter. And again, we've had so much in reference to his health that would kind of make sense. But the word here isn't necessarily tied to weight. It literally is the word heavy. And this is the same word that's used to talk about honor and reverence. So could it be a reference to him literally being weighed down, as if he's sitting there on the chair or whatever, in his full high priest regalia, right? He's got the breastplate. He's got the breastplate. He's got this, the stone tablet. He's got the shoulder pads with the names engraved. He's got the hat, and he's just weighed down. He's weighed down by all this stuff, and he's gotten so old, he's gotten so frail that he can't wear it anymore. He's too weak, as if his body can't handle the responsibilities that God's placed on him. I don't know. I'm not really sure where to go with this, but there's a couple of options, and the fat thing makes sense, but also the idea that he's just gotten so weak he can't even wear the regalia that he needs to as high priest. But either way, right, he's so shaken by the news, he falls over. And the imagery, again, like, okay, so we have a fact that happened, or we can all picture it. He lost his balance, it fell off the chair, and then he broke his neck because he's 98, and people who are 98 just die. That's just what they're supposed to do. I know that was harsh, I apologize. But it was funny. But the imagery is there, right? He is sitting as high priest. He is sitting as the leader of the city. He is sitting enthroned. He is sitting there as judge. And it's as though God, right, with this news, literally just shoves him off the chair, saying, it's not yours anymore. As if this is a moment of judgment. We are told that he was going to die with his sons. So this is very likely not just a coincidence, right? That this is literally God acting in judgment, saying, you are not going to sit anymore. You're not going to be high priest. This has been taken from you. So it may not be so much as him just losing his balance as actually God shoving him off the chair, which may seem harsh, but that's God. Sometimes God can be very blunt with his judgments. We do get a reference here, and I apologize. I forgot that Eli is referred to as a judge. I guess he's technically the 13th judge, but that's just an aside note, and I'm not going to correct it at this point. But it does mention that he has been judged for 40 years. Now, we do get references to previous judges who judged for about that long. But, so if he's 98, that means he's been judging since he was in his late 50s. That's quite something. And we do know that Samuel will take over his authority as judge. Right? That's partly why God has raised up Samuel. Now, Samuel's not going to take over as high priest, obviously, because he's not of the high priest line. But he is going to take over as prophet, and he is going to lead Israel, at least in the immediate aftermath of this catastrophe. So he is given the authority of the judges, and he will be the last judge. So in 19, Eli's daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and about to give birth. When she heard the news about the capture of God's ark and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband, she heard about her father-in-law first and then her husband. She might have been more concerned about her father-in-law than her husband. She collapsed and gave birth because her labor pains came on her. Now, this does happen, right? Women get, especially if there's a troubled pregnancy or whatever, a startle, a scare, some kind of shakeup can induce labor. That kind of thing does happen. And verse 20, as she was dying, which that's quite a jump, right? This isn't just her getting startled, but this has made things very bad. The woman taking care of her said, don't be afraid, you've given birth to a son. But she did not respond or pay attention. And in verse 21, she named the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel, referring to the capture of the ark of God and to the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband. Ichabod is... It's Chabad, which is the word for glory. It's also the word for heavy. So when it said that Eli was heavy, that's the word. There's some debate about how the same word can mean heavy and glory, which we don't necessarily need to get into. But the ik at the beginning turns it into some sort of question. So it's literally, his name is literally, if you can picture it, glory with a question mark. As if, where is the glory? Or, it's glory with question mark. Like that's somebody's name. That's the kind of thing Elon Musk would do. Just put a question mark for his kid's name. But we do see this, especially in, I guess I'll say more pagan literature, but the myths and so forth, that people who are dying, right, they're close to death, they're close to God, and then they'll give these sort of deathbed utterances, these deathbed prophecies. So here we have a woman, as she is giving birth, her dying words acknowledging that the glory has left, which is interesting. So in verse 22, the glory has departed from Israel, she said, because the ark has been captured. This is not the only time, right, we'll get reference to the glory of the Lord leaving the sacred space. Most famously will happen in Ezekiel 10, when Ezekiel prophesies that the glory will depart one final time from the temple. Then we get into the fun question of when did that happen? Right? Did it happen before the New Testament, or did it happen during the New Testament? If it happens during the New Testament, at what point does it happen? That's a fun exegetical question that we don't need to get into, because we're not doing Ezekiel or the New Testament. But it is a fun debate. Exactly when did Ezekiel's prophecy take place? When did the glory leave? So we're going to go ahead and go through chapter 5, because chapter 5 is a fun chapter. So in verse 1, after the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod, brought it into the temple of Dagon, and placed it next to his statue. So they bring it into the temple, and they place it next to Dagon. Now we mentioned Dagon because he comes up in the Samson narrative, and we talked about who exactly is Dagon. So the answer is we just don't know. We don't have a whole lot of references to Dagon outside the Bible. I think there are a few vague allusions to him in some Canaanite texts, but we just don't know a whole lot. The traditional interpretation is that he's a sea deity of some sort, like Poseidon. And often in imagery, iconography, you'll see him depicted as a fish, like a merman. That is not the current standard interpretation. So then you had the kind of the scholarly moving away from the sea deity, that he's some sort of harvest deity. And like Tammuz or Ninurta, you don't see male harvest deities all that often. Usually harvest deities are female for what should be obvious reasons, right? Because the earth is giving its bounty, and the earth is usually associated with the feminine, Mother Gaia, that sort of thing. But as far as I can tell, the current consensus, if we can call it a consensus, is that he's some sort of storm god. So maybe like Baal or Zeus. But again, we just don't know. We just don't know. But most pictures you see have him as some sort of like a merman. So we don't really know. But in verse 3, when the people of Ashdod got up early the next morning, there was Dagon fallen with his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and returned him to his place. Now, we should be able to picture this, right? So Dagon, the big statue of Dagon, is, I guess, looking out of, towards the opening or whatever, so you can go forward and, give your offerings or whatever, pray to Dagon. So I assume he's looking straight, through the entrance. Like, if this is the temple, the God would be right there in the center, looking toward the doors, right? So the ark, they just place like right in front of it, because they're making an offering to Dagon. Like, right, this is the great ark of the Israelites, of Yahweh, and we are making this to Dagon to let you know that we brought this to you as some sort of great sacrifice. So Dagon has fallen forward in front of the ark. The imagery should be rather obvious, as though he is bowing before the ark. That's the picture, that he is now subservient to the ark. I imagine this is a fairly large, heavy statue. It shouldn't just fall over. I doubt that this is a normal occurrence, and this would be a very, very bad omen for them. But, things happen. I don't know. I don't know how they justified it, but there's Dagon, right? This is a decent enough picture, right? You can still see that he's clearly like merman-like. He's got some sort of weird fishtail. But he's fallen off the pedestal, and he's now like making some sort of bowing indication to the ark that's right in front of him. This is probably the best picture I could find to show this image. Then in verse 4, but when they got up early the next morning, so this is the next day, there was Dagon fallen with his face before the ark of the Lord. This time, both Dagon's head and the palms of his hands were broken off, and lying on the threshold, only Dagon's torso remained. So this time, not only has he fallen before the ark, but the head is gone and the hands are gone. We know that something you would do, right, to make a point, you capture an enemy combatant or a king, is you would cut off their hands, right? Because that symbolizes that you're now impotent, right? You can't do anything with your hands. You're powerless. You're helpless, essentially. You cut off someone's head, right, not only to kill them, but it's also symbolic, right? The head being your authority, where the crown would be, or whatever. So not only is, the imagery should be really overt. So by removing his hands, the imagery here being Dagon is powerless, right? He is completely impotent before Yahweh. Losing his head means he has no authority, that he is as good as dead before Yahweh. This is really, really bad stuff, right? To lose your hands and your head. That he is just completely powerless before Yahweh. So verse 5. This is why, to this day, the priests of Dagon and everyone who enters the temple of Dagon in Ashdod do not step on Dagon's threshold. So it's, I guess, bad luck, bad sign, right? That this is where Dagon fell. This is where he was defeated, so you don't want to walk on there or whatever. Maybe it's a holy spot. What's curious to me is, how would the Israelites know that they don't do it anymore? Like, at what point did they talk to the Philistines just to ask them, like, hey, whatever happened to your Dagon temple or your Dagon statue? I don't know. I have no idea how they know this, but at some point they were told. Then we get one of the funniest things to happen in the book of Samuel. We get the plague of Ashdod. Oh boy, this is fun. So in verse 6, the Lord's hand was heavy on the people of Ashdod. So I don't know if the imagery or if the irony, how intentional it is, right? But what just happened to Dagon, right? He lost his hands. He is now impotent. He is now powerless. He does not have the power to protect himself, let alone his own people. And then the very next thing that happens is Yahweh has placed his hand on Ashdod. And that is, now, this can be, right, both images, right? When Yahweh puts his hand on someone, that can be a positive thing, right? He's protecting them, he's empowering them or whatever. but it can also be a very, very, very bad thing when God puts his hand on something. In this case, it is a bad thing. So we have the competing images, right? Dagon has lost his hands. He cannot help. He cannot do anything. And now Yahweh has put his hand on Ashdod. So we've got these two competing images. So the Lord's hand was heavy on the people of Ashdod. It's not just his hand, right? It is heavy. He is just pressing down on them, like holding them underwater, right? This is again, very negative, very violent imagery. Terrorizing and afflicting the people of Ashdod and its territory with tumors. We'll talk about what that means. So yeah, this is not good. This is really bad. Some sort of plague has afflicted the people of Ashdod in the wake of their deity falling and losing its hands and its head. So what is the Philistine plague? And if you've ever had a sermon or had a lesson on this, you've probably heard a couple of options. It is bubos, which is a swollen, inflamed lymph node in the armpit, groin, or other area. This has been interpreted generally in two ways. The first way is that it's talking about some sort of tumor. So this option is they're just having tumors growing all over their bodies. That would be very unpleasant. This is a rather nasty plague. Traditionally, in some older commentaries especially, or older translations, it was understood not just as tumors, but as anal tumors. I don't mean to be graphic, but you see a lot of translations as hemorrhoids. As far as I know, there's no indication in the text that it's that explicit. But it can refer to tumors. So it could be anything that can cause tumors. Maybe cancer. We just don't know. And also, as far as I know, there's nothing to indicate where they're spreading. So they could be these tumors everywhere. But it can also refer to just swelling, not necessarily just tumors, but swelling all over the body. And there are all kinds of nasty plagues that cause swelling on the body, from the bubonic plague to, again, other types of lymphomas, cancers, and so forth. So this would be a very scary, very nasty kind of event. One of the plagues of Egypt did involve sores, right? But that was a little different. They just had these blistering, open sores all over the bodies. This is I guess would be similar, but still different. They're just these tumors or these swellings just all over the body, and I imagine it would be very uncomfortable, and a lot of people died. So verse 7. When the men of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, "The ark of Israel's God must not stay here with us because his hand is strongly against us and our god Dagon." So it's not just that Yahweh is acting out against the people of Ashdod, but he's also afflicting Dagon. Which is kind of funny that they acknowledge it. Oh no, we have to save ourselves and our God because our God can't protect himself, let alone us. It's just kind of funny that they acknowledge it. So in verse 8, they called all the Philistine rulers together and asked. Now, of course, we know that the Philistines were a sort of confederation of cities that all kind of worked together in harmony. So I assume that this is the various leaders of the cities coming together. And they asked, "What should we do with the ark of Israel's God?" "The ark of Israel's God should be moved to Gath," they replied. So the men of Ashdod moved the ark. So I imagine they put in some sort of wagon. I assume that they were not fit to carry it, that they were not, strong enough or whatever. They just put it on a wagon and take it to Gath. So back to our map. We know where Shiloh is in the top eastern corner. We know where Ebenezer/Aphek is in the top western corner. So the Philistines would have taken it all the way down the coast to Ashdod, which is towards the southwest. So Gath, a very prominent Philistine city, that's going to be kind of near the southeastern portion of the Philistine territory. So they're just going to go, not too far away, just almost straight east. So they're heading to Gath. Verse 9. After they had moved it, the Lord's hand was against the city of Gath, causing a great panic. He afflicted the men of the city, from the youngest to the oldest, with an outbreak of tumors. This time we get a specification, right, that it's only the men, which I don't know how we know that. Was it really that pronounced? Was it really just against the men, or did it also apply to women? I have no idea. It just tells us men, but that's kind of odd if it's just the men. But regardless, we have the same plague outbreak happening in the second city. So in verse 10, the Gittites then sent the ark of God to Ekron. So it's now afflicted 2 cities, but they're going to try a third time, right? Third time's a charm. Third time's a charm. But when it got there, the Ekronites cried out, "They moved the ark of Israel's God to us to kill us and our people." So the Ekronites are not happy that it's being sent there because they've now associate the ark with this plague and with a very angry God that is now afflicting the Philistines. So this is kind of picturing the ark. Now they've loaded it back on the wagon and they're going to get it out of Gath. And so they send it to Ekron. So you can see Ekron is just to the north of Gath. So it's just kind of making the rounds all around Philistia. Nobody wants this thing. So in verse 11, the Ekronites called all the Philistine rulers together. This is the next time that they're doing it. And they said, "Send the ark of Israel's God away. It must return to its place so it won't kill us and our people. For the fear of death pervaded the city. God's hand was oppressing them. The men who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven." So it says those who didn't die. I assume that there were a lot of people that died. But even those who didn't die were still afflicted in some way. Again, we get the reference just to men, but I don't know, maybe a few women got sick. But it is really quite interesting, right? And we're going to pretty much kind of wrap up here, but the point of this chapter seems to be rather obvious, right? That we start in chapter 4 with the Israelites and the Philistines are at war with each other. The Israelites, as far as we can tell, don't ask God for their help. They just assume he's going to fight for them, then they lose the battle. So then they decide that they're going to use the ark, right? Because if they get the ark, God has to fight for them, right? Because it's the ark. But they're treating it like a token or a talisman or an idol of some sort. And yet, even with the ark, they end up losing. They lose worse than when they had it. And so, who knows, right? Maybe they're thinking, is God really going to fight for us anymore? Can God fight for us more? Can God take care of us? And so on and so forth. And so then, with the ark is now out of Israel, right? Is out of the Israelite custody. But now that it's in the Philistine territory, things are starting to happen, right? Dagon is defeated. He's effectively killed, right? And at least to the extent that a statue can be destroyed. And now the Philistines, multiple cities, are afflicted by this plague. As if to say that Yahweh is perfectly capable of defending himself, right? He doesn't need a tabernacle. He doesn't need priests. He doesn't need an army to defend him. He can do it himself. He is perfectly capable of defeating an entire nation on his own if he needs to. He just didn't want to help Israel because of reasons, maybe because they're being disobedient, or maybe because they're taking him for granted, or whatever. So that's pretty much where we're going to stop tonight, and we'll pick up tomorrow with the retrieval of the ark and kind of the rise of Samuel. Do you have a question? Yeah, what's your question? It probably is. I mean, you're right to point it out. My thinking immediately was, I'm thinking of Jonah, where the Ninevites, right, their wickedness has come up to heaven, which has gotten God's attention. But when they cry out, God does have pity on them, even though they're pagans. So it could be that they're crying out, and it's getting to a point where it could be an indication that their suffering is so great, and they're crying out. They might even be crying out to Yahweh to stop, whether or not they believe him or not. And it could be an indication that God is going to start taking pity on them. Like he realizes, they've suffered enough. I've done as much as I need to against them, because they're going to get rid of it, and then I guess is going to go back. That would be my assumption, that they've suffered to the point where God finally has heard them, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna back off a little bit now. You've suffered enough. Well, they've learned not to desecrate the ark. But if you want to finish or close.
Well, good study. Thank you. Very enlightening. Very enlightening. Let's pray and close. Father, thank you for this day that we've had together to worship you, to study your word, Lord, to hear your word. And Father, we pray you'll go with us, watch over us this week, meet every need, and help us, Father, to be your witnesses, Lord, to shine the light and be the salt in this world, Lord, that is so lost. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.